The night was silent, except for the sound of the rain tapping softly against the broken windows of a small, forgotten house on the edge of town. Inside, a boy sat motionless in the corner, his knees pulled tightly to his chest, his pale face half hidden in shadow. His name was Seamus. For 10 long years he hadn't spoken a single word, not to his teachers, not to his neighbors, not even to his own mother. No one knew why. Some said he was born broken. Others whispered that he had seen something no child should ever see. But on this night, everything was about to change. The house always felt different after dark. The walls seemed to breathe, the wooden floors creaked under invisible footsteps, and the air carried a damp, heavy smell, a smell no one could explain. Seamus's mother had warned everyone to stay away, especially the neighbors who dared to ask questions. She always smiled politely in public, pretending to be normal. But there was something cold about her eyes, something that made people uneasy. And yet, no one imagined what was hidden beneath the floor they walked on every day. Seamus had lived in silence for so long that his own voice had become a stranger to him. But tonight, for reasons even he couldn't understand, he felt a storm raging inside him. Something he had buried deep for years was clawing its way out. The sound of dripping water from a cracked ceiling echoed in the dark. Somewhere inside the walls, something scurried, scratching against the wooden beams. The faint hum of a refrigerator filled the silence, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder. Seamus sat there hugging himself, his breathing slow and shallow. He kept staring at the hallway, where the shadows stretched endlessly, almost alive, as if they knew his secret. His mother's footsteps were soft, deliberate, moving slowly from room to room. She always locked the basement door at night, turning the key twice, as though afraid of what might come out, rather than what might go in. And then, without warning, Seamus stood up. He walked quietly to the cracked window overlooking the neighbor's house across the street. The rain glistened under the flickering streetlight, each droplet sliding down the glass like tears. Something inside him was breaking. The silence he had kept for 10 years was becoming unbearable. He pressed his forehead against the cold window pane, eyes fixed on the neighbor's door. Downstairs, his mother hummed a strange, low tune while washing the kitchen floor. A soft scraping sound followed, something heavy being dragged slowly across the tiles. Seamus froze. He knew that sound too well. Every time he heard it, something inside him screamed to run, but his legs never obeyed. He stood perfectly, still listening, holding his breath, feeling his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Suddenly, lightning flashed, filling the room with a brief, blinding white glow. In that split second, Seamus saw his own reflection in the glass. Pale, hollow-eyed, and trembling. He didn't recognize the boy staring back at him. That was when he decided. Tonight, he would speak. He slipped out of his room, bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. Every step toward the front door felt heavier than the last, as though the house itself was trying to hold him back. He paused at the bottom of the stairs, glancing toward the kitchen. His mother's back was turned, her hands deep in the sink, scrubbing something furiously. Something red swirled in the water before disappearing down the drain. Seamus's throat burned, as if words were clawing their way up after years of being buried alive. He touched the doorknob slowly, twisting it, with trembling fingers. The old hinges groaned softly, and for the first time in his life, he stepped outside into the cold night air. Rain drenched his thin shirt instantly, but he didn't care. Across the street, lights flickered in the neighbor's living room. He ran barefoot, each step splashing through puddles until he reached the door. He stood there shivering violently, his wet hair sticking to his face. He raised his tiny hand and knocked, once, twice, 3 times. When the door creaked open, the neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, looked down, surprised to see the boy who never spoke standing there in the middle of a storm. She was about to ask if he was all right, but before she could say anything, Seamus whispered, his voice hoarse and broken, like the sound of dry leaves scraping against the ground. "She hides them under the floor." For a moment Mrs. Callahan froze, her breath caught in her throat. She knelt down, brushing the wet hair from Seamus's face, thinking she misheard him. But his eyes, wide, terrified and glassy, told her everything she needed to know. He repeated, barely louder this time, trembling violently. "Mommy keeps the people under the floor." Mrs. Callahan's heart began to race. She grabbed Seamus by the hand and pulled him inside, locking the door behind them. She tried to stay calm, but her hands shook as she dialed the emergency number. While the phone rang, Seamus just stood there in the living room, dripping wet, staring blankly at the flickering television. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Outside, thunder roared, and somewhere in the darkness of that house across the street, the basement door creaked open slowly, as if someone or something had been listening. The rain hadn't stopped. It fell harder now, hammering the rusted tin roof of the old house, drowning the street in darkness and cold. Inside, the lights flickered weakly, casting strange shadows on the walls that seemed to twist and breathe on their own. The air felt thicker than usual, heavy with something foul that clung to every breath. It wasn't the rain. It wasn't the damp wood. It was something else, something rotten, hidden deep beneath the house, seeping slowly into the night. The neighbors had whispered about it for years, the strange smell, the buzzing of flies that gathered around the basement window even in winter. But no one ever dared to ask questions. The mother, Evelyn, was polite in public but cold, detached, and unapproachable. Every time someone mentioned the odor, she would smile tightly and say the pipes were old, that the dampness of the house caused it. No one argued, but everyone knew something wasn't right. Tonight, the smell was stronger than ever. It wasn't just unpleasant. It was suffocating, crawling into lungs and clinging to skin. Even Mrs. Callahan, who had locked her door after letting Seamus inside, couldn't ignore it. She stood at the window, staring across the street at the boy's house, her heart pounding. The storm raged, thunder cracking loudly, but the house stood perfectly still. No lights, no movement, just darkness and silence. Too much silence. Behind her, Seamus sat quietly on the couch, dripping rainwater onto the carpet. His tiny fingers clutched the edge of a blanket, but he didn't shiver, didn't move, didn't blink. His wet hair hung over his face, hiding his expression, but his wide, glassy eyes stayed locked on the front door, as if expecting someone, or something, to come through it at any moment. Mrs. Callahan crouched beside him, her voice trembling as she whispered his name. But he didn't respond. He just stared, unblinking, his lips pale and parted slightly, like he was holding something back. That same hoarse voice from before finally slipped out, barely louder than the sound of the rain. "They're still there," he whispered. Her stomach dropped. She leaned closer, asking softly, "Who's there, Seamus?" Slowly, almost mechanically, the boy turned his head toward her. His voice cracked as he forced out the words, "The ones under the floor." A cold chill ran down Mrs. Callahan's spine. Her hands trembled as she tried to comfort him, but his body stayed rigid, stiff, as though frozen in place. He wouldn't look at her anymore. His gaze had drifted back to the door, his breathing uneven and shallow. Across the street, Evelyn moved through her kitchen. The storm muffled most sounds, but every now and then, a faint scraping noise carried through the wet air, like something heavy being dragged across the tiles. A cupboard slammed shut. Water ran in the sink. Somewhere deep in the house, a door creaked slowly open and closed. Inside the Callahan living room, the phone line clicked faintly as Mrs. Callahan finally reached the emergency operator. Her voice cracked as she tried to explain, but she struggled to find the words. How do you tell someone that a boy who hasn't spoken in 10 years just confessed that there are bodies hidden beneath the floorboards? The operator assured her that officers were on their way, but the storm was slowing everything down. Roads were flooding, power lines were falling, and most of the police force was already stretched thin. It could take a while. Too long. Mrs. Callahan hung up, her hands clammy and shaking, then turned back toward Seamus. But now, something was different. His breathing had grown louder, more uneven. His small chest rose and fell rapidly. His hands, gripping the blanket so tightly his knuckles turned white. She knelt in front of him, trying to calm him, but his whisper came again, this time even fainter than before. "She's going to be angry." Mrs. Callahan froze, her heart pounding. "Who's going to be angry, Seamus?" He didn't answer. Then, without warning, a loud banging echoed from across the street, 3 heavy, deliberate knocks on the front door of Evelyn's house. Mrs. Callahan shot up, rushing to the window, but the street was empty, bathed in rain and darkness. No figures, no movement, but someone had knocked. And then she saw it. For just a moment in the faint lightning flash, she spotted the basement window on the side of the house. Something had shifted the curtain. Something, or someone, was down there, watching. Before she could react, a sound came from behind her. It was soft, wet, and muffled. She turned slowly, her heart hammering in her chest. Seamus had risen to his feet without a sound. His face was pale, his lips trembling, his eyes fixed on the floor. He raised one small hand and pointed toward the hallway. Mrs. Callahan followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing but shadows stretching into darkness. But then faintly she heard it. A sound coming from beneath the house, distant, muffled but unmistakable. Knocking. One slow, hollow knock. Then another. Then another. Seamus pressed, his hands over his ears, and squeezed his eyes shut, whispering to himself over and over. "Don't answer them. Don't answer them." Mrs. Callahan rushed to him, holding him tightly, but her own breathing grew ragged, her ears straining to catch the faint, chilling sound beneath the floor. The knocking stopped suddenly, leaving only silence and the relentless drumming of the rain. Then, in that silence, a new sound crept into the room. Soft, shallow breathing. But it wasn't hers. And it wasn't Seamus's. It was coming from somewhere inside the walls. The storm raged deep into the night, washing the streets in darkness and thunder, but inside the Callahan house time seemed to have stopped. The boy sat perfectly still, his soaked clothes clinging to his fragile frame, his hands clutching the blanket like it was the only thing keeping him alive. Mrs. Callahan kept pacing the living room, glancing through the rain-streaked window at the house across the street, its shape barely visible in the darkness. It stood silent, unmoving, but it felt alive, as if it was watching them. Somewhere far off, the distant wail of sirens cut through the storm. Relief washed over Mrs. Callahan for a moment, but Seamus didn't react. He sat unmoving, his lips slightly parted, his eyes glassy, as though he was seeing something she couldn't. Then suddenly his small voice broke the silence. "They know now," he whispered, so softly she almost didn't hear him. Mrs. Callahan knelt down quickly, her voice shaking. "Seamus. Sweetheart, who knows?" He turned his head slowly toward her, his face pale, his wet hair plastered against his forehead. The words scraped out of him like shards of broken glass. "The ones under the floor." Before she could respond, flashing red and blue lights splashed across the rain-soaked street. 2 police cruisers pulled up in front of the boy's house, their headlights slicing through the darkness. The officers stepped out, their boots splashing in puddles, hands resting on their flashlights and holsters. Mrs. Callahan ran to the door and waved frantically, but Seamus stayed where he was, staring blankly at the window, unblinking. The officers entered the boy's house cautiously, calling out Evelyn's name, but there was no answer. The front door creaked open with a groan, revealing the dim hallway beyond. The smell hit them almost immediately, damp, earthy, and faintly metallic like old blood. One officer pulled a handkerchief over his nose, while the other switched on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the dust and shadows. Inside the Callahan house, Mrs. Callahan tried to distract Seamus, but he suddenly stood up, walking slowly to the window, pressing his hand flat against the cold glass. "They shouldn't go in there," he murmured. Her voice trembled. "Why, Seamus, why shouldn't they?" He didn't answer. He only whispered, his breath fogging the glass. "She's awake now." Mrs. Callahan's chest tightened. She looked toward Evelyn's house again. Through the flickering lightning, she saw the officers' flashlights move deeper inside. A third car pulled up, another pair of officers joining the search. Inside the house, the officers moved cautiously through the kitchen, their boots leaving wet prints on the cracked tiles. The air grew heavier with every step, the stench thickening, until it clung to their throats. One of them noticed the locked basement door at the end of the hallway. The lock looked old but sturdy, the keyhole rusted as if untouched for years. "Check this," one of them whispered, tapping the wooden door with his flashlight. Before anyone could respond, a sudden loud noise echoed from below. A deep, hollow thud, like something heavy had fallen in the basement. The sound reverberated through the house, making the walls tremble faintly. The officers froze, their breaths shallow, their hands instinctively gripping their weapons. Outside, Mrs. Callahan heard it too. The sound carried faintly through the rain, and she stepped back from the window instinctively. Seamus turned his head slowly toward her, his expression blank but his eyes strangely alert. "She told them not to go down there," he whispered. "Who told them?" Mrs. Callahan asked softly, her voice trembling. "My mom," he replied in a hollow tone, his voice almost mechanical. "She told them to stay out of the dark, but they never listen." Suddenly, a scream tore through the silence. One of the officers shouted from inside the house, his voice panicked, breaking through the sound of thunder. The others rushed toward the noise, their flashlights bouncing wildly against the walls. Downstairs, the locked basement door was now wide open. The officers stared at the stairway leading into total darkness, a cold wave of damp air rushing up from below. Their flashlights barely penetrated the blackness, and the stench was unbearable now, thick and choking. One officer gagged and covered his mouth, while the other slowly descended the first few steps. The basement was silent, except for the soft dripping of water somewhere deep within. Cobwebs clung to the corners, dust thick on the steps. The beam of the flashlight revealed old furniture, broken boxes, and stacks of rotting wood. But then something caught their attention. The floor. A large section of it had been disturbed, the dirt freshly turned. One officer knelt, brushing his glove against the damp earth, his breath uneven. He called out for backup, his voice cracking slightly. Another officer approached slowly, shining his light over the rest of the basement. That's when he saw them. 7 large, uneven mounds of soil stretched across the back of the room. The flashlight beam shook as his hands trembled, breath coming in sharp gasps. He took one cautious step closer, kneeling near the first mound. The soil was damp, darker than the rest. As he leaned in, his glove brushed against something sticking out, pale, waxy, cold. He recoiled instantly, his stomach twisting violently. It was a hand. Suddenly, a loud crash came from upstairs. The officers spun around, weapons drawn, flashlights swinging wildly. The kitchen door had slammed shut on its own, the echo reverberating through the house. They called out to their colleagues upstairs, but there was no answer. Outside, Mrs. Callahan saw shadows flicker rapidly behind the curtains of the boys' house. The lights inside were dim and unsteady, like something was interfering with the power. She stepped closer to the window, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, and then she froze. Evelyn stood in the window of the upstairs bedroom, her pale face half hidden behind the curtain, her eyes locked directly on the Callahan house. She wasn't moving. She wasn't blinking. Thunder rolled across the sky, shaking the ground beneath their feet. Inside the Callahan living room, Seamus turned from the window, his face pale and expressionless. In a voice so soft it was almost inaudible, he whispered. They woke them up. Before Mrs. Callahan could ask what he meant, the lights in both houses flickered violently, then went completely out, plunging the entire street into absolute darkness. The silence inside the house was suffocating. Even the storm outside seemed muted now, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The smell in the basement was unbearable, a thick, rotting stench that coated the back of the throat and burned the lungs. The officers moved slowly, their boots crunching against damp soil, their flashlights trembling in their hands as beams of pale light cut through the darkness. The air was cold and wet, and every sound, every drip of water, every creak of the old wooden beams above, seemed amplified. One of the officers crouched near the first mound of soil, his gloved hands shaking as he reached out, brushing away the loose dirt. The others stood back, holding their breath without realizing it. And then they saw it, the outline of pale, lifeless fingers breaking through the damp earth. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. The room was filled only with the low hum of their radios and the ragged sound of their breathing. One officer muttered under his breath, "Jesus Christ," before stepping back, clutching the flashlight tighter in his trembling hand. A radio crackled softly as another officer upstairs called in to confirm they had discovered possible human remains. Backup and forensic units were requested immediately, but the storm was slowing everything. Roads were blocked, power lines down, and they were completely on their own until help arrived. The lead officer, Sergeant Miller, knelt by the second mound, brushing away more soil. His fingers struck something solid, and when he cleared it, his stomach lurched violently. A small, pale foot, bare, motionless. 7 mounds, he whispered to himself, scanning the basement. 7. Another. Officer stepped closer, his voice low and cautious. "Sarge, you're not gonna believe this." He pointed his flashlight toward the far wall. The beam landed on something strange. A small wooden chair, old and splintered, facing the 7 graves. On the floor around it were tiny scraps of paper, damp and curling from the moisture. One of the officers picked one up carefully, unfolding it. It was a child's drawing, crude and smudged but unmistakable. It showed stick figures lying beneath a house, drawn in red crayon, with a single larger figure standing above them. The officer looked at the others, his voice trembling. These are Seamus's drawings." Suddenly above them, footsteps creaked faintly on the floorboards. Everyone froze, exchanging nervous glances. The radio hissed softly, but no one spoke. The storm roared outside, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled deep and low like an unspoken warning. "Sergeant." Miller turned off his flashlight and raised a hand for silence. The basement was pitch black now, only the sound of dripping water filling the void. The footsteps continued, slow and deliberate, moving across the floor directly above them. Upstairs, Evelyn's shadow passed by the hallway. The officers glanced at each other, unsure whether to confront her or stay put. Then suddenly, the footsteps stopped. A moment later, the sound of something metallic scraped against the basement door, a slow, deliberate turning of the key. The hinges creaked, and the door swung inward slightly, sending a cold draft rushing down the stairs. Sergeant Miller raised his weapon, calling out sharply, "Evelyn, stop right there." But there was no reply, just silence. One officer slowly climbed halfway up the stairs, flashlight trembling in his hand. He leaned into the doorway, scanning the hallway. Empty. The kitchen light above flickered weakly, buzzing like an insect. Suddenly a loud crash echoed through the house, followed by a low, guttural sound, like someone exhaling painfully in the dark. The officer stumbled back, retreating down the stairs. In the Callahan living room across the street, Mrs. Callahan held Seamus tightly, trying to keep him calm, but the boy wasn't trembling anymore. He stood perfectly still in her arms, his face blank, his glassy eyes fixed on the dark house across the street. When she whispered his name, he spoke without looking at her, his voice disturbingly calm. "They're finding them now," he said softly. Mrs. Callahan swallowed hard, struggling to keep her voice steady. "Who, Seamus? Who are they finding?" His head tilted slightly, his voice distant, detached, almost like he was reciting a memory. "The ones she kept. Mommy said they couldn't leave." Mrs. Callahan's breath caught in her throat, and her arms tightened around him instinctively, but he didn't seem to notice. He pressed his small hand against the window, his eyes unblinking. "They're not quiet anymore," he whispered. Back in the basement, Sergeant Miller finally ordered his team to secure the area. 2 officers began carefully digging into the first mound, working slowly through the damp earth until more of the pale hand was revealed. When they reached the arm, they stopped abruptly. The skin was waxy, the flesh loose, but it wasn't just decomposition. Around the wrist was a small strip of cloth, tied tightly, like a restraint. Another officer at the second mound discovered something similar. Thin rope still tied around the ankles, knotted so tight they had cut deep into the flesh long before death. Miller's voice was tight and low. "These weren't just buried, they were tied." The realization hit everyone at once. These weren't just bodies, these were prisoners. Suddenly, one officer let out a sharp gasp. He had moved his flashlight toward the last mound, and sticking out from the soil was something small, delicate, and horrifying. A child's shoe, half rotted, the laces still knotted neatly. Before anyone could process what they were seeing, the power went out completely. The entire basement was swallowed in total oppressive darkness. Then, from somewhere deep beneath the house, muffled and distant, came a sound, a single hollow knock, then another and another. The sound wasn't random. It was steady, rhythmic, like something or someone knocking from below the graves. The officers froze, breathless, their flashlights dead, their radios silent. And then, slowly, Sergeant Miller turned his head toward the staircase, his voice low and tense. "Everyone upstairs, now." But before they could move, Seamus's voice echoed faintly through the open basement door. It was quiet, but sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You shouldn't have woken them." The interrogation room was small, dimly lit, and cold. A single buzzing light hung overhead, flickering softly, casting uneven shadows on the pale grey walls. Evelyn sat at the metal table, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her posture unnaturally straight. There was no panic on her face, no tears, no trembling. She looked calm. Too calm. Across from her, Sergeant Miller studied her silently, waiting for some sign of fear, some crack in the mask she wore like armor. But she only stared back, her dark eyes flat and unblinking. Finally, Miller spoke, his voice low and controlled. 7 graves, Evelyn. 7 bodies under your house. Do you want to explain that to me? She tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words carefully, before answering with an unsettling softness. "I think you've already made up your mind about me, Sergeant. What would explaining change?" Miller leaned forward, planting his elbows on the table, his voice tightening. Then explain it to yourself. Tell me how they got there. For the first time, Evelyn's lips curved into the faintest hint of a smile. I didn't put them there, she whispered. Miller slammed a file onto the table, photographs of the 7 graves, the ropes, the restraints, the child's shoe. He pointed at them sharply. Then who did? Evelyn's smile faded slowly, and she leaned back in her chair, her fingers tracing the edge of the table absently. Her voice was quiet but steady, almost detached. Seamus knows, she said. Miller's jaw tightened. Your son is 10 years old. Her eyes finally flickered with something, irritation maybe, or something darker. You think you know him, she murmured. But you don't. Nobody knows him. Upstairs, in a quiet observation room, Mrs. Callahan sat with Seamus, trying to keep him calm while officers watched through the glass. He hadn't said a word since the basement. He sat on the edge of the chair, swinging his small legs slowly, staring at the floor. His pale face was blank, expressionless, as though he'd retreated somewhere far away. Mrs. Callahan leaned close, whispering gently, "It's okay now, sweetheart. You're safe here." Seamus didn't move. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Then, without warning, he raised his head and looked straight at the two-way mirror on the wall, directly at the officers watching from the other side. His eyes locked onto the glass, unblinking. An officer in the observation room muttered, "Does he know we can see him?" The psychologist, Dr. Hale, shook his head slowly, frowning. "He's not looking at us." "Then who is he looking at?" another officer asked. Hale didn't answer. Back in the interrogation room, Miller continued pressing Evelyn, but she seemed more interested in the ceiling than the questions. "Do you hear them?" she asked suddenly, interrupting him. Miller frowned. "Hear who?" Her gaze lowered slowly, and for the first time, a strange tremor entered her voice. "The ones under the floor." Miller froze. There was no way she could have known the forensic team had only just finished unearthing all 7 bodies. Before he could respond, Evelyn began humming softly, a low, haunting lullaby, rocking slightly in her chair. Her voice cracked on the final note, and then she fell silent, staring at her folded hands as if she hadn't spoken at all. The psychologist stepped into the room quietly, nodding at Miller. "Let me try," he whispered, taking the seat across from Evelyn. "Evelyn," Dr. Hale said softly, his voice calm and soothing. "We need to understand what happened in that house. Can you help me?" Evelyn's fingers twitched, tightening against each other until her knuckles turned white. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible. "He told me to keep them quiet." Miller frowned sharply. "Who told you?" But Evelyn didn't answer him. Her eyes shifted toward the observation window upstairs, where Seamus sat silently with Mrs. Callahan. Dr. Hale followed her gaze. "Are you saying Seamus?" he asked carefully. Evelyn's expression hardened instantly, her jaw tightening. "You have no idea what that boy is," she said, her voice low and venomous. In the observation room, Seamus suddenly began tapping his small hand against the table. At first it seemed random, soft, uneven taps, like a nervous tick. But then Mrs. Callahan noticed the pattern. Tap, pause, tap, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. She frowned. "Sweetheart, what are you doing?" Seamus didn't look at her, didn't speak, but Dr. Hale, watching through the glass, suddenly stiffened. "Wait, that's not random." "What do you mean?" one of the officers asked. Hale grabbed a pen and scribbled on his notepad, decoding the rhythm. "It's Morse code." They leaned over his shoulder as he wrote down the message, the letters forming slowly as the taps continued. SOON. Mrs. Callahan blinked, confused. Soon, What? Before anyone could answer, the lights in the station flickered violently, buzzing and stuttering. The hum of electricity faltered, and for a split second, the room was plunged into darkness before the emergency lights kicked in. Downstairs in the interrogation room, Evelyn smiled faintly again, her voice almost a whisper. "It's starting." Miller leaned forward sharply. "What's starting?" She finally met his eyes, and for the first time since her arrest, her voice cracked. "The house isn't empty." Before Miller could respond, a piercing scream echoed through the station from the observation room upstairs. Officers rushed to the hallway, guns drawn, but the sound wasn't coming from Mrs. Callahan. It wasn't coming from Seamus. It was coming from behind the two-way mirror, from the supposedly empty room next to them. The door to that room creaked open slowly, and the stench of damp earth and rot spilled into the hallway. Inside, in the faint emergency light, muddy footprints trailed across the floor, leading directly to the observation glass. Seamus, still seated, finally looked up at Mrs. Callahan and whispered for the first time since the basement. His voice was quiet, but the weight of it sent chills through her entire body. "They're not staying in the ground anymore." The police station was silent, except for the faint hum of the emergency lights. Every shadow seemed heavier now, stretching unnaturally along the walls, and the damp smell from that empty room was spreading down the hallway like a living thing. Officers stood frozen, guns raised, waiting for something, anything to move. The muddy footprints on the floor were fresh, wet, leading straight to the observation glass where Seamus sat inside. Sergeant Miller raised his hand slowly, signaling everyone to hold their position. His breath was shallow, every instinct screaming that something was terribly wrong. He stepped forward, his boots creaking softly against the linoleum, and leaned toward the open door of the dark room. He switched on his flashlight, the beam slicing through the shadows, and what it revealed made his stomach knot violently. The muddy footprints didn't start inside the room, they ended there. There was nothing. No open window, no broken vent, no sign of forced entry. Whoever or whatever made those prints had appeared inside the locked room and vanished. Suddenly, from inside the observation room, Mrs. Callahan screamed, "Seamus!" Everyone turned sharply, aiming their flashlights through the glass. Seamus was no longer sitting in his chair. He was standing, one small hand pressed against the two-way mirror, his face pale, his lips trembling as if whispering something silently to himself. Mrs. Callahan clutched him tightly, shaking, trying to pull him away, but his feet wouldn't move. He was staring at the glass, at the muddy handprint smeared across it from the other side. Dr. Hale burst into the room, kneeling in front of Seamus, speaking softly, urgently. "Seamus, look at me. You're safe, okay? You're safe here." The boy finally blinked, his glassy eyes shifting to Hale. His small voice cracked as he whispered, "No, we're not." Before Hale could respond, the lights above flickered violently, buzzing like angry insects. The emergency bulbs pulsed once, twice, and then went completely dark. The entire station was swallowed by pitch-black silence. Then, a sound. It was faint at first, coming from somewhere deep within the station. A slow, dragging scrape, like wood sliding across concrete. Then another. And another. Officers raised their guns, sweeping flashlights wildly as radios buzzed uselessly with static. Miller ordered everyone to regroup in the main hallway, but the sound was getting louder, closer. The dragging stopped suddenly, replaced by something else, a faint knocking. 3 knocks. A pause. 3 more. It was coming from below them. Miller realized with a cold, sinking dread that the station sat on top of the old town storm tunnels, long, winding passages built a century ago, mostly abandoned now. The knocking was coming from somewhere in those tunnels, directly beneath their feet. "Get everyone upstairs," Miller ordered sharply, his voice tense. "Now." Mrs. Callahan clutched Seamus, but the boy wasn't moving. His breathing was shallow, his tiny hands clenched tight at his sides, fingernails digging into his palms hard enough to draw blood. His lips began to move soundlessly, forming words no one could hear. Dr. Hale crouched in front of him again. "Seamus, talk to me. What do you see?" The boy's jaw trembled, his pupils dilating, until almost no color was visible in his eyes. Finally, in a hoarse whisper, he said, "They're coming up." Before anyone could react, a deafening crash echoed from somewhere below the station, shaking the floor beneath them. The emergency lights flared back on briefly, bathing the hallway in red, and in that moment everyone saw it. Water leaking slowly from the cracks in the floor. But the water was thick, dark, and smelled like rotting soil. Miller barked orders for everyone to move to the upper level, but as they reached the stairs, the sound returned. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, wet footsteps, coming from the hallway. Behind them, an officer at the back of the group spun around, aiming his weapon. "Stop! Who's there?" No answer. The footsteps continued. Miller turned, raising his flashlight, and for the briefest second, he thought he saw someone standing at the far end of the corridor. Small, frail, their clothes tattered and dripping with mud. But when the light hit them fully, there was no one there. Mrs. Callahan's grip on Seamus tightened, pulling him against her chest as she whispered, "It's okay, sweetheart. Don't look." But Seamus was already staring past her, his lips parting slowly, his voice barely audible. She let them out. Miller glanced sharply at Evelyn, who had been brought upstairs under guard after the interrogation. She was seated against the wall, her wrists cuffed, her head lowered, humming that same haunting lullaby under her breath. Miller crouched in front of her, his voice low and sharp. "Evelyn, tell me what's happening right now." She lifted, her head slowly, her eyes hollow but oddly calm. "You woke them," she whispered. "I told you not to dig." Miller clenched his fists. "Who are they?" Evelyn leaned closer, her breath shallow, and spoke so softly he had to lean in to hear her. "They were never meant to leave the house." A sudden crash of shattering glass erupted down the hallway, followed by an officer's scream. Miller and two others rushed toward the sound, flashlights darting wildly. They found Officer Reyes lying on the floor, his face pale and drenched in sweat, pointing shakily at the broken window ahead. "I saw someone," Reyes stammered, "standing outside in the rain." Miller looked out the window, but the street beyond was empty, the storm pounding against the glass. Then faintly, in the reflection of the glass itself, he saw them. Shapes. Dozens of them. Standing perfectly still behind him, their figures pale and dripping with mud. He spun around instantly. The hallway was empty. Back in the observation room, Seamus had started drawing again. They'd given him paper and a pencil earlier, hoping it would calm him, but now his small hands were moving furiously, sketching shapes with disturbing speed. Mrs. Callahan watched in silence, her breath shallow, until he finally stopped and slid the paper across the table. It was the house. Their house, the basement, the 7 graves, and beneath them, tunnels. Dozens of tunnels, twisting and crossing like veins beneath the earth, stretching far beyond the property. At the deepest point of the drawing, Seamus had shaded a massive black circle, pressing the pencil so hard into the paper it nearly tore through. Above the circle, in shaky, uneven letters, he had written one word: below. Dr. Hale stared at the drawing, his throat dry, his voice trembling. "Seamus, what's below?" The boy didn't answer at first. He just stared at the black circle, his small hand trembling, tears pooling in his eyes, though he made no sound. Finally, in the faintest whisper, he said, "Where they sleep." Before anyone could process his words, the fire alarm blared suddenly, shrill and piercing, drowning out everything else. Officers scrambled, shouting orders, but the sound wasn't coming from the smoke detectors. It was coming from deep underground, echoing through the pipes like a warning. Evelyn started laughing softly from across the hall, rocking back and forth against the wall, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "You can't keep them out," she murmured. "You never could." The hallway lights flickered once more, then died completely, plunging the entire station into darkness. In that suffocating silence, Seamus's soft voice broke through like a thread of ice. "They're here." The station was plunged into complete darkness. For a few seconds, no one moved, no one breathed. The silence was so deep it felt alive, pressing in from all sides. Then, slowly, the emergency lights kicked in, bathing the hallways in a pulsing, red glow. Shadows crawled across the walls, distorted and restless, like something just beneath the surface was trying to take shape. The air felt thicker now, damp and cold, carrying that same rotten smell from the house's basement. Soil, mold, and something metallic beneath it all. Sergeant Miller barked orders, his voice sharp and low. "Everyone regroup in the main hall, now." Officers moved quickly but cautiously, their boots slamming against the linoleum floor, weapons drawn. The sound of heavy breathing and clattering gear filled the hallway as they gathered, forming a tight perimeter around Seamus, Mrs. Callahan, and Dr. Hale. Evelyn was seated against the wall, her hands still cuffed, rocking slowly back and forth, whispering that same haunting lullaby under her breath. The tune was low, broken and uneven, like a memory rotting from the inside out. Her eyes never lifted from the floor, but there was a faint, unsettling smile curling at the edges of her lips. Miller stepped closer to her, crouching so they were face to face. "You're going to tell me what's happening," he demanded, his voice taut. "Right now." Her humming stopped abruptly, and for the first time since she was brought into the station. Evelyn raised her head. Her hollow eyes locked on his, and her lips trembled slightly as she whispered, "It's too late to stop it." Miller's jaw clenched, his grip tightening around his flashlight. "Stop what?" She blinked slowly, almost dreamlike, before saying, "The ones you pulled from the ground. They were never meant to leave." Dr. Hale moved closer, his expression tense but curious. "Evelyn, what's beneath that house? Why was Seamus drawing those tunnels?" At the mention of his name, Seamus stirred slightly in Mrs. Callahan's arms. His small voice broke through the silence, thin and fragile, like glass cracking under pressure. "It's not just our house," he said softly, his eyes still distant, unfocused. "It's all of them." Hale knelt beside him, gently holding his shoulders. "All of what, Seamus?" The boy's pupils were wide now, almost swallowing the color from his irises. "The tunnels," he whispered. "They go everywhere. Under the streets, under the station. They're already inside." Before Hale could respond, a loud crash echoed from somewhere deep below, shaking the floor violently. Dust rained down from the ceiling as lights flickered erratically, buzzing like trapped flies. Several officers instinctively raised their weapons, forming a defensive circle, but the sound wasn't coming closer. It was rising. A low, rumbling vibration filled the entire station, traveling through the floor and into their bones. Somewhere beneath them, something was moving. Miller grabbed his radio, barking into it. "All units, basement sweep now. I want eyes on those tunnels." Two officers hesitated, exchanging uncertain glances. "Sir, the basement's sealed," one said nervously. Miller's expression darkened. "Then unseal it." Within minutes, a team descended into the lower levels of the station, forcing open the heavy maintenance hatch that led to the old storm tunnels. The smell hit them instantly. Damp earth, rotting wood, and something worse. Something sweet and sickly that clung to the back of the throat. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, beams trembling as they revealed the narrow concrete passage beyond. The walls were slick with condensation, water dripping steadily from overhead pipes, echoing faintly into the silence. "God," one officer muttered, covering his mouth with his sleeve. "It smells like a graveyard." They pushed forward cautiously, boots splashing through shallow pools of stagnant water. The deeper they went, the colder it became, the air thick with moisture and decay. The sound of their footsteps bounced unnaturally in the tunnel, as though something was following just a few steps behind. "Hold up," another officer whispered sharply, raising his hand. "Do you hear that?" Everyone stopped. At first, there was nothing but silence. Then, faintly, from somewhere ahead, came a soft sound, rhythmic, uneven. Drip, drip, drag, drip, drip, drag. It wasn't water. The officer at the front aimed his flashlight forward, and its beam landed on something smeared. Along the tunnel wall, handprints. Small, pale handprints pressed deep into the wet concrete as though someone had clawed their way out of the ground itself. Back in the station above, Seamus suddenly gasped sharply, clutching his chest, his tiny body shaking violently. Mrs. Callahan held him tight, panicking. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" His breathing came in ragged bursts, his eyes wide, pupils darting rapidly as though he was seeing something no one else could. Then he screamed, a raw, piercing sound that shattered the tense silence of the hall. "They're awake," he cried. Evelyn laughed softly from her corner, rocking faster now. "I told you," she sang under her breath. "You shouldn't have dug them up." Dr. Hale grabbed Miller's arm, whispering urgently, "We need to get him out of here. Whatever's happening, Seamus is somehow connected to it. He's seeing something before it happens." Miller nodded grimly, signaling for the boy to be escorted upstairs immediately. But Seamus refused to move. His tiny hands gripped the metal chair so tightly his knuckles were white. "We can't leave," he whispered, shaking his head violently. "Why not?" Hale asked gently, crouching in front of him. The boy looked up slowly, his voice trembling. "Because they're already here." Before anyone could process his words, the radio from the tunnel team crackled violently with static. Then came a distorted voice, panicked and breathless. "Sarge, you need to—" The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a low, guttural sound, like something heavy being dragged across wet stone, followed by muffled screaming. Miller grabbed the radio, shouting into it. "Team 1, respond. What the hell's going on down there?" Silence. Then, faintly, the sound of footsteps echoed through the radio speaker. Not one pair. Dozens. The officers in the tunnel never answered again. Suddenly, the emergency lights in the station flickered violently, then exploded, plunging everyone back into darkness. The only sound was the pounding of boots upstairs as officers scrambled to secure exits, but then, silence again. Seamus tilted his head slightly, his voice so quiet it was almost lost in the dark. "They're moving through the walls now." Evelyn stopped rocking abruptly. Her head lifted, and for the first time her face twisted with genuine fear. "It's too soon," she whispered. "It wasn't supposed to happen this soon. Doctor." Hale rounded on her sharply. "What wasn't supposed to happen? Tell us." But Evelyn's eyes weren't on him anymore. They were fixed on Seamus. "You told them," she breathed, her voice cracking. "You showed them where to go." Seamus looked at her, his expression unreadable, and for a moment it felt as though the two of them were communicating silently, something unspoken passing between them like a thread of static. Then, softly, he whispered, "I didn't have to show them. They already know." From somewhere deep beneath the station, the knocking began again. Slow, steady, relentless. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. Only this time, it wasn't coming from below. It was coming from the walls. The silence after the knocking was unbearable. No one in the station moved, no one breathed, every muscle locked tight with dread. The red emergency lights pulsed faintly, washing over terrified faces like distant warning sirens, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally along the cracked walls. Then came another set of knocks. 3. Slow, measured. Pause. 3 more. This time, the sound wasn't just in the walls. It was beneath their feet, above their heads, all around them, surrounding the station like a living heartbeat. Miller grabbed his radio again, his knuckles white around the device. "Tunnel team, respond." His voice echoed sharply in the silence, but only static answered him. Suddenly, the main hallway lights flickered violently, buzzing as if something inside the wires was clawing its way out. A low hum filled the room, deep and bone-shaking, like the growl of something enormous buried underground. Then came the scream. It tore through the station from somewhere below, raw, wet, and human, followed by rapid gunfire, a deafening burst that was cut off as suddenly as it began. The officers froze, weapons drawn, staring at each other in silent terror. Dr. Hale turned to Miller, his voice shaking. "We need to get everyone out. Now." But Miller shook his head slowly, his expression grim. "If we open those doors, we don't know what we're letting in." Evelyn laughed softly from her corner, rocking back and forth, her cuffs clinking with each movement. Her voice was low but sharp, cutting through the tension like glass under pressure. "You think you can leave?" she whispered almost to herself. "You think they'll let you?" Seamus, still seated in the chair, suddenly gasped, not a sound of fear but of recognition. His small hand trembled as he pointed toward the far wall of the station. "There," he whispered, "they're coming from there." Everyone followed his gaze. At first the wall looked perfectly solid, but then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the plaster began to bulge outward, like something inside was pushing against it. Cracks spider-webbed across the surface, thin streams of dust falling to the floor. "Back up," Miller ordered, his voice low but firm. The officers took aim, lining up in a defensive formation, weapons shaking in their hands. The bulge grew larger, the cracking louder, until suddenly the wall buckled inward with a wet, tearing sound. What crawled out was not human. Its body was thin, impossibly pale, the skin stretched tight over jagged bones. Its mouth hung open wider than it should have, jaw unhinged, teeth crooked and needle-sharp. Its eyes were empty pits, dark and bottomless, reflecting nothing. The creature moved unnaturally fast, lurching forward on elongated limbs, its wet fingers clawing at the ground. One of the officers screamed, opening fire, bullets tearing into the thing's torso. But it didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. Then, impossibly, the creature opened its mouth and screamed back. The sound wasn't natural. It wasn't animal. It wasn't human. It was deep, layered, like hundreds of voices trapped inside a single throat, crying out at once. The glass windows in the hallway shattered instantly, spraying shards across the floor. Officers clutched their ears, staggering, several dropping to their knees. Miller shouted something, but his voice was drowned beneath the sound. He grabbed the nearest officer and shoved him toward the door. "Go! Secure the lobby!" 2 more. Creatures pulled themselves from the cracked wall, their bodies twitching violently, movements erratic, as though something unseen was controlling them like puppets. Seamus screamed suddenly, clutching his head, his small body trembling violently. "Stop shooting!" he cried. "You're making it worse." Dr. Hale knelt beside him, panic in his voice. "What do you mean worse? What are they?" Seamus's wide eyes locked on his, pupils dilated until almost black. His voice came out soft, but shaking, like he was speaking from somewhere far away. "They're not alive," he whispered. "They've been dead for a long time. Before Hale could process it, one of the creatures lunged forward, grabbing an officer by the throat and slamming him against the wall with unnatural strength. Bone cracked. The officer went limp instantly. Chaos erupted. Gunfire, screams, shattering, glass. Miller ordered everyone back toward the main stairwell, but Evelyn began laughing louder, her voice shrill and manic. "You're wasting bullets," she screamed. "They don't bleed, they don't breathe. You can't kill something that was never alive to begin with." Suddenly, from deep below the station, a low rumbling began, vibrating through the floor like distant thunder. Dust rained from the ceiling as the walls shuddered violently. Seamus's breathing became ragged, and his tiny hands clawed at the arms of the chair, splinters digging into his palms. "They're waking up," he whispered hoarsely. "All of them." The floor beneath their feet cracked, long fissures spreading, rapidly like veins of black ice. From the tunnels below came a sound no one could describe. Not footsteps, not voices, but something in between. A swarm, thousands moving together. Dr. Hale grabbed Seamus by the shoulders, trying to anchor him. "Listen to me. What's coming? What are we dealing with here?" The boy's lips trembled. "They were buried to keep them in," he said, softly, almost chanting. "But you dug them up, now they're hungry." Suddenly the power cut out completely. The station was swallowed in total darkness. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of ragged breathing, shuffling boots, and faint whispers echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. Then, one by one, small red lights began to flicker, on along the hallway walls. Not the station's lights. These were glowing from inside the cracks, like something beneath the concrete was alive and breathing. A deep, guttural voice whispered through the static of the broken intercom system. The sound was distorted, fragmented, but the words were clear enough to freeze everyone where they stood. "Let us out." Evelyn stopped laughing instantly, her face going pale as she stared at the ceiling. "It's too early," she muttered again, rocking violently now. "It's too early, it's too early." Ooh. From the far end of the station, heavy footsteps echoed slowly, deliberately, like something massive had risen from the depths below. Each step sent vibrations through the floor, knocking picture frames from the walls. Dr. Hale turned toward Miller, his face white. "We can't stay here." Miller nodded grimly, signaling for the officers to fall back, but the hallway ahead was already filling with movement. Dozens of pale figures emerged from the darkness, their twitching bodies illuminated by the faint red glow. Seamus's voice broke through the chaos, soft and distant, but clear. "This isn't the beginning," he whispered. "This is the part where everything ends." Then the ceiling above them cracked violently, raining debris and dust as something enormous began forcing its way down from the floor above. The entire station groaned under the weight of it, metal supports twisting, glass shattering, alarms blaring. The creatures in the hallway stopped moving all at once, their heads tilting sharply toward the sound above. For a single, fleeting moment, silence fell again. Then the roof exploded inward. The explosion from above shook the entire station like an earthquake. Chunks of ceiling collapsed, spraying dust and debris across the floor. The air filled with choking plaster and the piercing sound of alarms. But beneath the chaos, something far worse could be heard. A slow, wet, dragging sound, as if something massive was pulling itself into their world. Miller shouted orders, but his voice was drowned by the deafening noise. Officers scrambled, coughing, their boots crunching on shattered glass and splintered wood. Dr. Hale dragged Seamus under a table, shielding the boy from falling debris, but Seamus wasn't looking at the ceiling. His wide, blackened pupils were fixed on the floor beneath them, as though he could see straight through the concrete. "They're here," Seamus whispered, his voice barely audible. "They're all here now." A guttural roar split the air, shaking the walls and knocking framed documents to the ground. Evelyn's laughter cut through the chaos like broken glass, wild and high-pitched, bouncing off the walls unnaturally. "You brought this on yourselves." She screamed, yanking against her cuffs until her wrists bled. "You woke them up. You opened the door." Miller turned on her sharply, grabbing her by the shoulders. "What door? What are you talking about?" But Evelyn only smiled, her bloodied, teeth glinting in the emergency lights. "The one they buried them in," she whispered. "The one beneath your feet." A sudden cracking sound erupted from the floor. Splits spread rapidly like lightning strikes, opening jagged gaps in the tile. From below came an unearthly stench, damp soil, rot, and something metallic. Then slowly, pale hands began clawing their way out of the cracks. One hand, then another, then dozens. The first creature pulled itself out fully, its distorted limbs bending at impossible angles. Its hollow sockets reflected the faint red glow from the cracks beneath, its twitching body jerking unnaturally as if guided by invisible strings. Another followed, then three more until the hallway swarmed with them, their movements fast and erratic, scrambling across walls and ceilings like starving insects. Gunfire erupted instantly, the deafening bursts of sound echoing off the concrete walls. Bullets tore through several creatures, sending chunks of pale flesh spraying, but they kept moving, crawling, leaping, twisting, unbothered by wounds that should have killed them. Dr. Hale dragged Seamus toward the rear stairwell, shouting for Miller, but Seamus resisted violently, his small frame trembling. "Don't go down there," he cried, his voice hoarse and cracking. "Don't go into the tunnels." Miller spun around, panting, weapon raised. "What tunnels?" Seamus's wide eyes locked on him, tears streaking his dirty cheeks. "The tunnels they built to hide them," he whispered. "They're still down there, waiting." Before anyone could respond, the station's fire sprinklers kicked on, spraying freezing water over everything. The droplets hit the creatures, pale skin, and sizzled like acid, releasing clouds of steam and high-pitched screeches. One of the officers shouted, "It hurts them. Keep the sprinklers running." But Seamus shook his head violently, clutching his ears as if in pain. "No." "You don't understand." In an instant, all the creatures froze mid-motion, their bodies going unnaturally still, heads tilting in unison toward the boy. Slowly, as if connected by some invisible command, they began crawling toward Seamus, ignoring everyone else entirely. Dr. Hale stepped in front of him instinctively. "Stay back," he shouted, firing his weapon wildly. Two of the pale figures fell, twitching violently on the wet floor, but five more replaced them, moving faster now, their jaws unhinging wider than humanly possible. Miller grabbed Seamus, hoisting him into his arms. "We're getting out of here," he shouted, pushing through the chaos toward the rear exit. But as they neared the door, Evelyn's voice cut through the noise, sharp and commanding. "Don't take him there," she screamed, her body thrashing violently in her cuffs. "If you go outside, they'll follow him. They'll never stop." Miller hesitated, his grip tightening around Seamus. "Then where do we go?" Evelyn's wild eyes met his. "Down," she whispered. Dr. Hale turned on her furious. "Down? Are you insane? That's where they're coming from." Evelyn's voice dropped to a cold, dead calm. "And that's where it ends." Before Miller could respond, the floor beneath them gave way entirely, collapsing into a massive pit that opened like a hungry mouth. Evelyn, Seamus, Dr. Hale, and three officers plunged into darkness, debris falling with them, the roar of creatures above fading as they fell deeper and deeper. When they landed, the impact knocked the air from their lungs. Miller groaned, trying to push himself upright, his hands scraping against damp stone. They were in a vast underground chamber, the ceiling so high it disappeared into darkness. Strange symbols covered the walls, etched deep into the stone, glowing faintly with a sickly red light. Seamus stood shakily, his small hand brushing the carvings, his breath shallow and uneven. "I've seen this before," he whispered. Evelyn's head snapped toward him. "No," she said sharply. "You weren't supposed to." Dr. Hale shined his flashlight on the nearest symbol, frowning. "This isn't just writing," he muttered. "It's instructions." Miller glanced around, sweat dripping into his eyes. Instructions for what? Evelyn finally spoke, her voice low and shaking. "For keeping them inside." Suddenly, from deep within the tunnels, a low, rhythmic thudding echoed. Distant but growing louder, like footsteps of something massive approaching. The ground vibrated with each beat, dust falling from the stone ceiling above them. Seamus clutched his head, screaming, collapsing to his knees. "It's waking up," he cried, his voice cracking under the strain. "You shouldn't have come here." Then, from the shadows, something stepped into the faint red glow. It wasn't like the pale creatures from above. This was larger, taller, its skeletal frame cloaked in damp earth and rotting fabric, its hollow eyes glowing faintly. The sound it made wasn't a growl or a scream. It was a word, broken and layered, as though 1,000 voices spoke through one mouth. "Return." The walls trembled violently, cracks spreading as the glowing symbols began to fade. Evelyn backed up slowly, her voice trembling for the first time. "If the markings go dark," she whispered, "there's nothing holding them back." Dr. Hale turned sharply to Seamus, grabbing his shoulders. "What do they want?" Seamus's voice came out soft, distant and hollow, as if he wasn't fully present anymore. "Not me," he said. "Her." Everyone turned to Evelyn, her lips parted, trembling. And for the first time since her arrest, real fear filled her eyes. "I tried to keep them quiet," she whispered, "but they want what's theirs." The massive figure stepped closer, the damp earth around its feet cracking with each step. Its gaze locked on Evelyn, and though its mouth never moved, its voice echoed through the chamber, low and final. "Blood must answer blood." The lights on the walls extinguished all at once, plunging the chamber into suffocating darkness. Then came the sound. Dozens. No, hundreds of whispers crawling from every direction at once. The whispers grew louder, crawling through the darkness like a living thing. They didn't sound human anymore. They sounded older, heavier, as if the walls themselves were breathing. The damp stone beneath their feet vibrated faintly, as though something deep beneath the tunnels was stirring after a very long sleep. Miller fumbled with his flashlight, but the beam flickered violently and died, swallowed by the oppressive blackness. "Somewhere nearby," Dr. Hale muttered, his voice trembling. "There are hundreds of them," he whispered. "Maybe thousands." Seamus stood perfectly still, his small frame outlined faintly by the dying red glow of the symbols carved into the walls. But the markings were fading fast, one by one, like candles being blown out in some silent ritual. "They were never graves," Seamus said softly, his voice sounding far older than his 10 years. "They weren't buried to hide them. They were buried to hold them." Evelyn grabbed his arm sharply, her nails digging into his skin. "Don't you dare say it," she hissed, her voice low and trembling. "You don't understand what you're inviting." But Seamus turned to her, his dark, dilated eyes locking onto hers. "I didn't invite them," he said coldly. "You did." Evelyn flinched as if struck, her lips parting wordlessly, but before she could speak, the ground beneath them rumbled violently. Dust rained from the ceiling, the air growing thicker, heavier, charged with something unnatural. Miller pulled his weapon free, though his shaking hands betrayed his fear. "Evelyn," he barked, "start talking. What the hell is this place?" Evelyn's breath came shallow and ragged as she glanced toward the fading symbols on the walls. Finally, in a hoarse whisper, she said the words no one expected. "My family built these tunnels." The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Hale stared at her in disbelief. What are you talking about? Evelyn's voice trembled, her words tumbling out faster now, as though she'd been holding them in for years. Generations ago, my great-grandfather and his brothers, they were part of something. They thought they'd discovered a way to cheat death. She pointed to the carvings on the walls, her wrists still bound in bloody cuffs. These symbols aren't warnings, they're locks. They created this chamber to keep something inside. Seamus tilted his head, his small voice eerily calm. But you broke the locks. Evelyn's breath hitched sharply, her chest heaving. I didn't have a choice, she whispered. They told me to. Who? Miller demanded, stepping closer. Evelyn's wide, terrified eyes turned toward the shadows crawling along the far wall. The voices, she breathed. I thought they were nightmares, but they've been here the whole time, whispering, waiting, feeding. Suddenly, one of the remaining symbols on the wall went out, extinguished like a dying ember. Then another, and another. The whispers stopped. In the silence that followed, the air shifted. Something vast, ancient and unspeakable was awake now. From the farthest tunnel, deep in the darkness, came a sound so low and deep it rattled their bones, a single drawn-out inhale, as though something enormous was taking its first breath. In centuries, Seamus collapsed to his knees, clutching his head, his small body trembling violently. His voice came out fractured, strangled between gasps. It knows we're here, he whispered. It knows who we are. The ground split open, violently beneath them, revealing a pit of writhing, half-rotted bodies, their twisted forms clawing toward the surface. The pale creatures from the station above, dozens, maybe hundreds of them, began swarming out, their hollow eyes fixed on Evelyn. Miller fired round after round, his bullets tearing into their bodies, but they didn't slow. Dr. Hale grabbed Seamus, pulling him behind a crumbling pillar, but the boy's eyes were unfocused, distant, as if he were hearing something only he could understand. They don't want us, Seamus whispered. They want her! Evelyn stumbled backward, shaking her head violently, tears streaking her dirt-stained face. No, she whispered. No, no, no. I kept them quiet. I did everything they asked. But the creatures moved closer, their twitching limbs jerking violently, their mouths opening wide in silent screams. Dr. Hale shouted over the chaos, grabbing Evelyn by the shoulders. What did you do? Her breath came out in broken sobs. The voices promised me, she cried. They said if I gave them others, they'd leave Seamus alone. Miller froze, turning sharply toward her. Others? He demanded. Evelyn's head dropped slowly, her tears mixing with the dirt and blood on her face. The 7 graves, she whispered. They weren't strangers. The words hung heavy in the damp air. Dr. Hale's voice broke. Who were they? Evelyn's lips trembled, her voice cracking. Seamus's brothers and sisters, she whispered. All of them. Miller staggered backward, stunned. You killed your own children? Evelyn shook her head violently, her voice rising in panic. I didn't kill them. I offered them. It was the only way to keep him safe. She pointed at Seamus, her eyes wild, desperate. He isn't what you think he is. The ground rumbled, violently again, louder this time, the chamber trembling under the weight of something colossal moving beneath them. Seamus stood slowly, his small frame rigid, his breathing deep and unnatural now. When he spoke, his voice wasn't his own. You should have let me sleep. The sound wasn't human, layered, distorted, carrying a weight far older than his 10 years. The creatures immediately froze, bowing their heads as if in reverence, their jerking movements suddenly perfectly synchronized. Dr. Hale whispered, trembling, My God, they're not hunting him. They're following him. Evelyn sobbed violently, dropping to her knees, her hands clawing at the damp stone floor. I tried to stop it, she cried. I tried, but it's inside him. It always has been. Seamus's dark, endless eyes locked on her, unblinking. "You woke me up," he said softly. "Now I'm hungry." The creatures surged forward, but instead of attacking, they circled Seamus, their bodies twitching violently as they formed a perfect ring around him. From deep below, the rumbling grew louder, splitting the chamber floor as jagged fissures opened wide, glowing faintly with an unnatural red light. Dr. Hale grabbed Miller, pulling him back. "We have to get out now," he shouted, but it was too late. From the pit, something impossibly large began to rise. A towering figure, its body wrapped in chains etched with the same fading symbols, its skull-like face tilted downward as if sensing every breath in the room. The chains snapped one by one with loud, deafening cracks, each release shaking the entire chamber. Evelyn screamed, scrambling backward, but the figure ignored her completely. Its hollow, endless gaze locked only on Seamus. Then, in a voice like stone grinding against stone, it spoke a single word: return. Seamus tilted his head slightly, his expression empty. Slowly, almost gently, he whispered back, "No." The chamber erupted in chaos. The glowing fissures burst open, blinding red light spilling into the darkness. The creatures shrieked in unison, their bodies convulsing violently as the walls split apart. Evelyn reached out for Seamus, sobbing, "Please, baby, please come. Back to me." But Seamus didn't move. His small hand lifted slowly and the creatures obeyed. Every single one turned toward Evelyn and smiled. The screams that followed drowned out everything else. The cracking stone, the roaring tunnels, the crumbling world above. Then, as suddenly as it began, silence fell.